What I want to do first of all is to finish up looking at the 26th translation, which is the translation of Ronald Knox. And then we're going to go rapidly through several in a row before we come to another one that will cause us to slow down somewhat. As you can see, though, we're getting closer and closer to the 1980s, so we're getting very close to the end of our study in biblical literature. I said some negative things in evaluating Ronald Knox's translation, and I said this morning I would come back and say a couple of positive things about Ronald Knox and his translation. So we're on the other foot. Some good things. First of all, Ronald Knox, remember this is a Roman Catholic translation, the first authorized official one of the 20th century into English. Ronald Knox was a superb English writer. I think I told you last time he was known for everything from being a churchman to a Bible translator to an author of detective stories. So was a superb English writer, extremely versatile, quite at home in the English language, as we've seen, very well trained, very capable. So what we would expect from a writer of this caliber is a good English translation with the emphasis on English. Because it's erroneously based on the Vulgate, it can't be a reliable translation, but the English reading of it should be superb. So are our expectations met? Well, I've collected a few sentences one writer wrote about Knox in his translation, and I quote these. A man who had the uncanny instinct for getting the right word or the right phrase in any given context. A master of English style. Equivalence of effect is what he aims at throughout. Never did a translation read less like a translation. That's just a collection of some sentences that one writer had to say about Ronald Knox, his ability as a writer in his translation. Knox himself said that he wanted his translation, the Holy Bible, done in 1955, to be read in the year A.D. 2150. In other words, he was putting it about 100 years ahead. He wanted people to be able to read his translation in the year 2150, or a couple of hundred years ahead, without sounding dated. You know how language changed from year to year, decade to decade. He wanted his to be so accurate that he'd pick the right words, that the words weren't too colloquial, so that they're too confined to the 1950s or the mid-20th century, so that a couple of hundred years later, in the year 2150, people would be able to read his translation without missing a beat. They would understand everything that's said, all the words would be words still used, and the people would be capable of understanding that. Let me give you just a few examples of his goodness as a writer of English, whether it's, poetry, prose, Bible, detective stories, children's stories, whatever. In Psalm 119, this is a great acrostic in the Old Testament where successive verses, 8 in a row, begin with successive letters of the Hebrew alphabet. You start with, as it were, A, you have 8 verses that will begin with that, B, C, and so forth. Well, it's, of course, virtually impossible to duplicate that in English, just because Hebrew words start with different letters than English words. That is, in the transliteration. And if you pick up your KJV, you'll see that it's not duplicated at all. You would have no way of knowing, really, that Psalm 119 is different, unusual in this regard, if the KJV didn't divide it up, as it does, into 8 verse sections with the Hebrew letter and with more or less an equivalent English pronunciation of that letter. Well, what Knox has done in his Old Testament is he has marvelously reproduced that in English, so that the first 8 verses begin, the first word in that verse begins with the letter A. Then from verses 9 to 16, every verse begins with the letter B, right on through the alphabet. And think when you get to Q's and Z's and things. But he does it. He's a remarkable writer. So we have to say good things about people if they have the ability. That's just a marvelous, splendid accomplishment. Very few people could do that. I doubt I could do that. I wouldn't know enough words that start with enough letters that it's got to make sense. It's got to somehow correspond to the Hebrew. You just can't invent something and say, well, I need a Z, let's see, or I need an X here, let's see, now what starts with X or Z? He just throws them all in, and it does just wonderfully. Then if you'll turn in the Old Testament to Leviticus chapter 17, let me give you some readings from his Old Testament. And you can be the judge of how well it sounds, but these are thought of as some good passages in his Old Testament. Leviticus 17, short chapter, beginning with verse 10. Any Israelite or alien dwelling among you who consumes the blood when he eats becomes my enemy. I will sever him from my people. It is the blood that animates all living things, and I have destined it to make atonement for your souls upon the altar. Blood for the purgation, there's that good Catholic term. Blood for the purgation of your souls, which is okay in the Old Testament, but it's just typically a Roman Catholic word. That is why I have warned the sons of Israel that neither they nor the aliens who dwell among them must consume the blood when they eat. Any Israelite or alien living among you who hunts down a beast or snares a bird, such as you are allowed to eat, must drain its blood and cover it with earth. Because it animates all living things, I give the sons of Israel this warning. Never, on pain of death, turn it to your own use, the blood that holds the life. And then one other small section that represents his Old Testament in the Song of Solomon. The Song of Solomon, chapter 2. The Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verses 8 through 14. Song of Solomon 2, 8 through 14. The voice I love. See where he comes, how he speeds over the mountains, how he spurns the hills. Gazelle nor fawn was ever so fleet of foot as my heart's love. And now he is standing on the other side of this very wall. He is looking in through each window in turn, peering through every chink. I can hear my true love calling to me. Rise up quickly, dear heart, so gentle, so beautiful. Rise up and come with me. Winter is over now, the rain has passed by. At home the flowers have begun to blossom. Pruning time has come. We can hear the turtle dove cooing already there at home. There is green fruit on the fig trees. The vines and flower are all fragrance. Rouse thee and come, so beautiful, so well beloved, still hiding thyself as a dove hides in a cleft of rock or a crannied wall. Show me but thy face, let me hear but thy voice, that voice sweet as thy face is fair. Very good translation. Very flowery translation, but that's what the Song of Solomon is all about, I suppose. So we have to say this positively about Knox, that he's a very good English writer, and for the most part, his whole translation reads very well. There are a few places where the reading is not so clear, is not so good English, and that would be expected of almost anyone. One good example, which I won't take the time to read, is 2 Corinthians 10, verses 14 through 18. 2 Corinthians 10, verses 14 through 18. It does not read that clearly, nor that well in English. And then a second and a final positive thing about Ronald Knox's translation, and it concerns the ongoing, perpetual Protestant Roman Catholic debate on whether we should translate a certain Greek term as repent or as do penance. So it's the do penance versus repent issue, which has been an issue always between Roman Catholics and Protestants in Bible translating. Well, of course, Knox started off as an Anglican, but he's a good Roman Catholic when he does his translation. And Roman Catholics like the word penance versus repent, and it says something entirely different. So we would expect Knox would be faithful to his Roman Catholic adopted heritage anyway, and give us do penance. Well, of course, that's not true, or I wouldn't be putting this under a good point with him. In 49 out of 58 occurrences of the Greek term, he gave repent or something similar, such as repentance. In 49, the Greek word behind this appears 58 times in the New Testament. In 49 of those, he gives repent or its equivalent, repentance. You say, well, that means we have 9 left over. Well, that doesn't mean that the 9 other places are given as due penance. Only two times out of 58 does Knox stoop to this mistranslation of due penance. P-E-N-A-N-C-E. Only 2 times out of 58. I've already said 49 he gives repent. What about those other 7? Well, he gives things like be sorry, or one had a change of heart or a change of mind, which is more or less a literal translation of the Greek or of the Hebrew, and such like. The 2 places that are exceptions are Matthew 12:41 and Luke 11:32. Matthew 12:41, Luke 11:32, 2 out of 58 places where Knox gives us the Roman Catholic translation of due penance. So let me sum up what we've spent a little over a week saying in this area of Ronald Knox and his translation. It's an important translation because it is the first complete, authorized, official Roman Catholic translation in English in this century. Now, I've already hinted at, you might not have caught it, but last time we've already hinted at the fact that another Roman Catholic translation is in the process of being done, and we'll say more about that later, but it's not complete at this time, and so we're waiting for its completion date before we throw it in as one of our numbers to study. But Knox's is the first one, so anytime it's the first, then that just holds a position of eminence and prestige to begin with. Also, since Knox was first a Greek scholar, remember he taught himself Hebrew later on, then we would expect, and our expectations are met, the New Testament is much better than the Old. The New Testament is much better and it's much more accurate than the Old. Also, as I've already said this morning, his translation reads very well. It's not, old KJV language. It's not in the language of the people, or simple English, or common English, or basic English. It's kind of like what's been described as a timeless English, which is exactly what he was after, so that people in 2150 AD could read it and it wouldn't sound dated to them. Timeless English, which really takes, you have to have a knack to be able to do that, to be able to be as familiar as he was with the English language, so you know what terms are just terms that will not pass away, and what terms have been influenced by the general ethos of the mid-20th century. But, however, I would not recommend Knox's translation, obviously, because of its chief fault, which is a major fault. It's not based on the original texts. It's based on the Latin Vulgate. That ruins it for really any Protestant, or for any Roman Catholic today, probably, who's thinking about matters. It ruins it as an English translation. Doesn't matter how good the English is, the translation has to be poor because it's based on an inferior translation of the original or the early text of Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And besides that, as we also saw last time, he has some Roman Catholic peculiarities, such as in Romans 3, in Romans 4, especially Romans 4:22, wanting to tone down the term justification. Instead, he gives us the term virtue. It was counted virtue in him. Abraham, it was counted virtue in him instead of he was justified, or was imputed unto him for righteousness. As well as some of his notes on things like Matthew 1:25 that we discussed last time, advocating the doctrine of the perpetual virginity of their Lady Mary. So I don't recommend it as a translation. All right, let's go on. You have any questions on Ronald Knox? Number 27 then this morning. Number 27, the authentic New Testament. The authentic New Testament. Same year, 1955. Now the title right away sounds a little arrogant. This is the authentic. Anybody who's ever tried a New Testament besides me was wrong. Well, that's not what he meant by giving this title. What he meant was the he was pointing to the significance of the New Testament itself. This is the authentic book. In other words, the New Testament's the authentic book, not my translation is the authentic translation. That's what he means by the title. It's a little misleading, to be sure. It sounds a little boastful and arrogant, the authentic New Testament. But what he meant by that was that the New Testament's the authentic book of the world. It's the chief, first, foremost book. Not my translation of the New Testament is the authentic translation. Anyway, the authentic New Testament, which is a little-known work, was the work of a distinguished Jewish scholar whose name was Hugh, his middle initial J, Hugh J. Schoenfield. Very similar to Schofield, but it has an N in it. Schoenfield, S-C-H-O-N, Schoenfield. His desire, and notice that it's just the New Testament, his desire, according to the preface, was to treat the New Testament books, I quote, as if they had recently been discovered from a cave in Palestine. Remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls had just been unearthed a couple of years earlier. Or from beneath the sands of Egypt, and have never previously been given to the public. So in one sense, he wants to, as it were, start all over again. Pretend as though nothing had come. Pretend as though, even though this is the authentic book of the world, no one has ever heard of this book before. It's just been discovered from a cave in Palestine, or from beneath the sands of Egypt, and never previously been given to the public. And his translation would be the first. Now again, I don't think he meant anything that prideful or boastful. He just wanted to, rob himself or strip himself or free himself from preconceived notions of things and just pretend like, well, we're starting all over. This is in the beginning. We're going to translate the New Testament into good English, and it'll be the first time, and we don't have all of the forefather translations before us, but the fate of the whole world will be upon our shoulders due to the fact this is the first time it's been given, and therefore we must be reliable. He had a certain unique argument that was really the basis for his translation, and it ran something like this. Because the New Testament, although it's a Christian document, was written by Jews, then only Jewish scholars, even if they're Jewish Christian, or especially if they're Jewish Christian, I should say, only Jewish scholars can hope to give us the best translation. Why? Because only they will have a feel for and be able to bring out the Jewishness of the New Testament. And there is a lot of Jewishness to it. It was, for the most part, written by Jews. Well, that sounds logical, because the New Testament's written by Jews, that only Jewish scholars can hope to give us the best translation. It sounds logical, but I think a person would be hard-pressed to prove that, though. It's a questionable thesis. But his is a good translation. Very little known. It's no longer in print today. But his is a good translation. He gives us an introduction to his New Testament. He gives us many notes. And in the introduction and notes, he provides a good source of background material on the New Testament's Jewishness. Hugh J. Schoenfield. It's a fairly reliable translation, but little known, so we don't need to spend a lot of time with it. And in the introduction and notes, he provides a good background, arguing his case that the New Testament is indeed a Jewish book. And his argument was only a Jewish scholar could fully perceive and appreciate the Jewishness, at least latent in the New Testament documents. As I say, that's a questionable thesis. It appears to be logical. One problem that we have with that whole thesis is this, that we just don't have, I can't think of any really great, or let me say it this way, not very many, really great, important Christian scholars who are Jews. And I guess that's due to a lot of what Jesus and Paul had to say, that the veil is upon their heart in the reading of the Word of God. Very few of the writing conservative scholars today in the Protestant world come from a Jewish background. That would make us, of course, wholly dependent on the conversion of very eminent Jewish scholars before we could hope to appreciate or read with understanding the New Testament. And to me, that sounds like a very questionable thesis. Besides, the whole thrust of the New Testament is that the church will end up being, and it becomes very quickly, a Gentile church, although we know it has a Jewish origin and Jewish roots right back into the Old Testament. Governed, to begin with anyway, by Jewish leaders, that very quickly passes off the scene. The church will become a Gentile church, and for the most part, Gentiles will be the, quote, scholars, unquote, the leaders of the church down through history. And that has proven to be the case. So I don't really trust his thesis, although it sounds interesting. Number 28. What we call, we're going to sum up a couple of things here, but what we call the Penguin translations. The Penguin translations. That's just because of the serial of publication. You've got the Penguin Classics today, little paperback books. You've got two things here. The Gospels done in 1952, the book of Acts done in 1957. So in following my general practice, we're going to take the latest date, 1957, and discuss it here. So 28 follows Numbers 26 and 27, both of which were dated 1955. We'll date 28, 1957. So we're going to have to go back and pick up the work done in 1952. Now, we've already skipped one important Roman Catholic translation, the Confraternity Bible. The Confraternity Bible of 1941. And that's because we're going to pick it up later whenever we see it as a complete translation. So that's why we have to skip over the 1952 date and try to sum all this up under 1957. Well, anyway, the Gospels done in 52 were the work of the classical scholar E.V. Rue, R-I-E-U, E.V. Rue. Acts was the work of his son, C.H. Rue, R-I-E-U, 1957. Now, when we get to number 20 or number 30 here in just a few moments, we're going to be talking about the work of Phillips, J.B. Phillips. So I just have to mention ahead of time the fact that Dr. Rue, E.V., the father, and Phillips knew each other, and there were ongoing discussions in England between these two men, Dr. Rue and the Bible translator J.B. Phillips, concerning their respective theories of translation. There was even an important, with one criticizing the other, radio broadcast in 1953 in England. And these two men were asked to attend, and because their translations were important in the 1950s, they were just coming out then, and they were asked to come on the radio and debate the whole issue of theories of translation. We'll say more about Phillips later. Well, just like Schonfield's authentic New Testament, Penguin translations are little known, but like the authentic, they're fairly good. Acts is probably better, Acts being the work of the Son, C.H. Rue. Acts is probably better than the Gospels. Acts, along with the translation, Rue has given us 30 pages of introduction to the book of Acts, and the equivalent of 60 pages of notes. If you take all the notes from one page and the bottom of the page and put them together, you have the equivalent of 60 pages of notes, 30 pages of introduction. Very thorough work. Matthew, the work of his father, is marred because Rue places in footnotes each time the author Matthew refers back to the Old Testament to see a fulfillment of some prophecy. Why put that down in the footnotes? Why not leave it right in the text? Every time Matthew says, we're talking about the four Gospels, every time Matthew says, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, all that's taken out of the text and dropped down into a footnote. I guess what he wants to do is keep the narrative of Matthew flowing without the intrusions of the Old Testament. But Matthew wants the intrusions of the Old Testament. They're there. He wouldn't be quoting them if he didn't want them. He wants them to prove a point, that Christianity is firmly rooted in predictive Jewish prophecy found in the canon of the Old Testament. So I think it's marred, Matthew especially. Matthew's the one that does all the quoting from the Old Testament, so I pick him out among the other gospel writers. But Matthew is marred because of the fact that all Old Testament quotations are dropped into footnotes. And let me give you one translation in Matthew 3:15, which is already unusual enough in the KJV, with the term suffer, which means allow, but still it's a little unusual. People don't generally know what it means when they're first reading it. Matthew 3:15 with the term suffer, and with this business of fulfilling all righteousness. This concerns Jesus coming to John asking to be baptized of him. And John forbids him, and he said, "Well, suffer to be so now, for thus it fulfills all righteousness." Well, you already have a problem even in that translation in trying to interpret that. What does that mean? What is he saying there? It behooves us to fulfill all righteousness. How does his baptism fulfill righteousness? Well, if that's not bad enough, here's how E.V. Rue translates it. Matthew 3:15, to which Jesus replied, "Consent now. It behooves us to conform with all right usage." And John consented. What in the world does that mean? I think you're a little further off from the narrow path to the truth of the passage with E.V. Rue's translation. Jesus replied, "Consent now. It behooves us to conform with all right usage." And so John consented. At least we know what consent means versus suffer. Well, I'll let you figure what the verse means. Number 29. Entitled The Holy Bible from Ancient Eastern Manuscripts. The Holy Bible from Ancient Eastern Manuscripts. 1957. It's better known as the so-called Lamsa Bible. L-A-M-S-A. L-A-M-S-A. And number 29 will differ from all of the translations we have discussed or that we shall discuss in 20th century work, in that it is taken from the Syriac Peshitta. Not Greek, not Hebrew, not even the Latin Vulgate. Those would be our three choices so far. Really two, either the original languages or once removed language, the Latin Vulgate. Those are really our two choices. And of course the vast majority of them that we will discuss will come from the original tongues of Hebrew and Greek. Well, here's a unique one, the Lamsa Bible. The official name is the Holy Bible from Ancient Eastern Manuscripts. Was taken from the Syriac Peshitta. So what I would have to say in the first place regarding the Lamsa Bible is see your notes under Lit tape number 119. I don't know what we're on now. It's like 219 or something this morning, somewhere in that area. So that was about 100 messages ago. Lit tape 119. This is the Bible that I brought along before. It's a very weird, unusual Bible. So I would say see your notes under Lit tape 119, especially the end of that message. The end of Lit 119 for my comments and especially criticisms of this Bible. Lamsa, of course, was a Syrian. He was born in Syria. George Lamsa, I believe George was his first name. George Lamsa. Lamsa is his last name, L-A-M-S-A. That's where the Bible gets its common name. And he had a real strong attachment to his own land and to his own mother tongue and language. And so he felt that this was really the original, that the Greek and the Hebrew of later years was corrupted, he just goes on and on in the introduction. And I remember on Lit Tape 119, I read some of the introduction to you, what all his theories were. So I'm not going to take the time to do all of that again. I'm just looking at this, all my things I have underlined, all of his criticism of the Greek and Hebrew, that he felt that they were too late, and they were wrong. Of course, Greek and Hebrew would have come as the original languages, but we don't have the autographs. We have to move ourselves several centuries beyond the time of the original writings, and by then it's been corrupted. And so how has the Bible been preserved, free of corruption? Well, in the Syriac tongue, it's been preserved, free of corruption. That's his theory. And this Bible has sold a lot because it's like an esoteric Bible. People say, oh, so this, the ancient Syriac Peshitta. Even it sounds scholarly, you know, the Syriac Peshitta. That's the original Bible, and you'll find the true text found there. And I've heard and know of several people who have gone out and bought this. It's the whole Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Someone's raising their hand. Somebody got deceived over there earlier with it. This is the, and it even says, you know, Holy Bible there. Holy Bible from ancient Eastern manuscripts. You just know that, man, this is back to the days of what dynasty in China or Japan or something. So we have the true reading here. Well, it's a complete lie as far as I'm concerned, and I think I know what I'm talking about. It's a complete lie. Let me give you a couple of very interesting, probably the two best known, but erroneous variants that are found in Lamsa's translation. At least one of these I'm sure I've mentioned before. One of these, well, both are in Matthew. Matthew 19:24. Matthew 19:24. Now, here in this passage, this must be where Jesus is talking to the disciples, warning them against covetousness. Let me just look his up. I've looked it up before, but I'll just get all of it in his context. Okay, he's got a paragraph signed with 23, so we'll start with Matthew 19:23. Jesus then said to his disciples, "Truly I say to you, it is difficult for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven." Verse 24, "Again I say to you, it is easier for a rope to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God." With the variant rope. Well, that has a lot of history behind it. You do a little reading in some of the church fathers and you'll find that reading. And I'll tell you why. You should be able to see it. Why anyway? Otherwise, if you don't translate it something besides camel, what you have just done is either you've made the verse have no sense at all to it, or you've denied the entrance of any rich man in the kingdom of heaven. It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter into the kingdom. All right, when we'd be reading, we'd stop and ask ourselves, all right, how easy is it for a camel to go through the eye of a needle? And your response would be, it's impossible. Okay, how easy is it for a rich man to get into the kingdom? It'd be impossible. You know, if you're going to take the analogy all the way through, it'd be impossible. And so what that would lead to is exactly what it led to in the early church, the lifestyle of the monk. You have to surrender everything. Take your vows of silence and your vows of poverty. Forsake this world and flee this world, because if you have anything, you're guaranteed by this verse that you won't get into the kingdom of heaven. Well, rope is a little easier of a reading. I mean, a camel's got a big hump on his back, and I think that's why it was chosen as the representation here. The eye of a needle, something with a hump on it. You could have said a boat or something like that, or a loaf of bread. But a camel so big, with such long legs and a long neck and a big hump, is impossible. But a rope, well, maybe if you had a big enough needle with a large enough eye and a small enough rope, you could squeeze it through there, which would mean perhaps at least a few rich people could enter into the kingdom of heaven. So what has happened is a deliberate toning down by some scribe somewhere in history, somewhere in textual history, a deliberate toning down. And you find it in the church fathers as well. They want to translate it as rope rather than camel. And there are some other things about that. There's an old story that goes back to, I think, the 12th century, that the eye of the needle was the name for a specific gate into Jerusalem that was so low a camel had to get down on its knees to get through there. And again, showing that, well, it's hard, it's difficult, but at least you can do it. So that still leaves the way open for rich people getting into the kingdom. That only dates back to, I think, the 12th century A.D. in Christian writings. Well, camel and rope just happen to be the same word in Aramaic. Aramaic and Syriac are related languages, as you know. So it was very convenient for George Lamsa to strike out camel and put in rope. And he even has a footnote here in his Bible that the Aramaic word for camel is the same for rope. And the context would have to dictate how you're going to translate it. Well, obviously the context here would tell you rope, because camels can't go through the eyes of needles. But ropes, possibly, depending on the smallness of the rope and the largeness of the eye of the needle, possibly a rope could. Well, it's purely false. The word originally is camel, and the word should be camel. And it's obviously a figure of speech. He's speaking by hyperbole. The deduction must not be read woodenly from that. Camels can't go through needles, the eyes of them, therefore people with money can't get into the kingdom of heaven. Because the rest of the New Testament would deny that. For instance, in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 17, Paul tells Timothy, charge those that are rich in this world to what? Give up their money? No, not to be high-minded or to trust in uncertain riches. 1 Timothy 6:17. Charge those that are rich to give them up, because rich people can't enter the kingdom since camels can't go through the eye of a needle. No. Paul said, charge those that are rich in this world not to be high-minded and not to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who giveth us richly all things to enjoy. 1 Timothy 6:17. So it's hyperbole. Camel is fine. Obviously, camels can't go through the eye of a needle, but rich people can enter the kingdom. But it's very, very difficult. That's what he's trying to say here. It's very, very difficult. What he's also trying to say is very, very few rich people will ever make it into the kingdom of heaven. Well, that's obvious. The same passage with the quote I just gave you, 1 Timothy 6, gives us 1 Timothy 6:10 also, that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. So it has a proper balance there, which you'll also find in Matthew 19, Mark 10, and so forth. There's one of the interesting variants in Lamsa's Bible. The other one is in Matthew 27:46. Matthew 27:46. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice and said, Eli, Eli, lemana sabachthani, being translated, my God, for this I was spared. Or, my God, this was my destiny. This was my destiny. Now, this has become a very well-known variant. By the way, it's known by charismatics and non-charismatics alike. So it hasn't just become well-known because of the events I'm going to tell you now. It was well-known by others even prior to what I'm going to say. But it has become well-known since the spread of the JDS heresy and teaching. You will remember they make a lot of this verse, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, in the KJV reading. That Jesus was utterly forsaken of the Father on the cross. He took on himself the nature, the seed of the serpent, and you know the rest of that story. Went to hell and had to be born again and so forth. And so some of the people, the very few evidently in the charismatic world, who are opposed to the JDS heresy, have found Lamsa's Bible a bosom buddy, a very close friend because of the translation here. This type of translation takes away any difficulty at all with the so-called forsakenness of Christ on the cross. All he's saying is, oh, my God, this was my destiny. He realizes this is what I was born for. This is what it's all about. It's simply a cry in that regard, not a cry, why hast thou forsaken me? And so this is supposed to help explain, or maybe even do away with, the mystery and riddle of Christ's forsakenness on the cross. Now, one particular writer that I'm familiar with, his name is David Alsobrook. David Alsobrook. His last name is spelled just like it sounds. 2 words, a compound word, Alsobrook. David Alsobrook has several different books out on things like the precious blood, which are books written against the JDS teaching. And he builds a lot of his case around Matthew 27:46 from the Lamsa Bible. Of course, for people in Tulsa and other places like that, I don't guess it makes any difference, because they say, well, Lamsa, what's that? That's not reliable. You got to stay with the KJV or something like that. Well, here the Tulsa people just happen to be right. Lamsa's translation is not reliable at all. Remember, he's going back to what the Syriac said. And it's a little bit of a mystery how the Syriac ever ended up with this. But it's not what the Greek says. And we don't need to try to tone down a difficult passage here. We need to face a difficult passage and try to delve into some of its mystery and some of its riddles. That's the best thing to do. Don't just, whenever you find a text that won't agree with your theory, explain it away or look for a variant reading. If the evidence is in favor of a difficult passage here, keep it. That's what God wants us to have. There must be something here. So what it should read is what you already know and have. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? I've mentioned that before about Alsobrook and his writings on the precious blood. I have one man that I know that has sent me some of Alsobrook's writings and was curious about this translation. This was a number of years ago. And so I had to write back to him and explain to him what Lamsa was all about and say, read the introduction to Lamsa's Bible and you'll see that it's not that reliable. Okay, I think we've got enough time left to get into number 30 this morning. Now we're going to spend the rest of our time on number 30, the New Testament in Modern English, 1958. All of next week on number 30, and if we don't get through, part of the next week on 30. The New Testament in Modern English, 1958, better known as J.B. Phillips' Bible, which is still in print. I've got various copies of it, but here's a complete copy. It came out in segments, letters to young churches, the Young Church in Action, the Gospels, Revelation, and so forth. So I've got it in its serial publication, but here it is all together in a modern, revised paperback edition. The New Testament in Modern English. This is even a revised edition by J.B. Phillips. So you can find this. It's still available right in bookstores today. Now, of the surprisingly large number of modern English translation in the language of the people and so forth, of the large number of those which have come out in the 20th century, the vast majority of them have come from foreign writers, Scottish or generally British. This is no exception. J.B. Phillips was an Englishman. And of the large number, J.B. Phillips is certainly the best known. J.B. Phillips is much better known than Moffat, Goodspeed, Weymouth, all these others that we've discussed thus far. Haven't you all heard of J.B. Phillips, even though you said you didn't have his Bible? You at least have heard of him. J.B. stands for John Bertram, B-E-R-T-R-A-M, John Bertram Phillips, who lived from 1906, you're going to be surprised to hear this, to 1982. He just died recently, since you've been a part of this church. 1906 to 1982. He was called Jack by all of his friends, but he's best known to the general public by his initials, J.B. Now, we're going to spend enough time on this. I think I need to defend my decision to spend enough time on this, to say everything I want to say. We're going to spend a lot of time on J.B. Phillips, first of all, because his translation is the dominant one in modern English Bibles. And nothing since the time of Phillips has been written which has overtaken the vast, vast readership of Phillips' Bible. 1958, that's what, 30 years ago. 30 years ago. It's still being printed. People read from it and devour his translation. We're also, secondly, going to spend a little longer on him because I know Phillips better. I know his life better because of his autobiography, recently published, entitled The Price of Success. He has some other things like The Ring of Truth that we'll talk about later, which is a book telling some about his theories of translation. But The Price of Success, published by Shaw Publishers in Wheaton, Illinois. Shaw, S-H-A-W. So because I have his own autobiography before me, I know a lot more about him, and I have read it several times, and I've read it very thoroughly. And then thirdly, another reason we're going to spend a whole lot of time on Phillips is because personally, as an individual, as a, quote, Christian, unquote, he has to be one of the worst of the lot. Demon oppressed, if not possessed, as I think I'll be able to prove probably even before we get through this morning. Now I know most people would say, well, what difference does it make how the man lived in his own private life? At least we've got a good translation. Well, I don't buy that theory at all. I don't think you can separate a man and his spiritual condition from his work. The translation may be good, quote unquote, popular, no quotation marks, it's certainly popular, but what and if it has a demonic influence behind it? What and if the man who did it was a psychic, was demon-possessed? I don't care how well he knows Greek and Hebrew. That says a whole lot to me. Now, you'll not be followed if you choose to believe what I'm telling you right now by most people out there in the evangelical world. They say, it doesn't matter, don't get into his private life. It doesn't matter what Phillips did in his private life. He was an excellent scholar, a world-class communicator in the English language, and I don't question either one of those. He was a world-class communicator, much like C.S. Lewis, and they knew each other, by the way. A world-class communicator, especially over radio. But we've got a whole lot of world-class communicators today. A lot of your famous radio and television preachers are very, very good speakers. And if you don't know that they're not saying anything, they can hold your attention. As soon as you know they're not saying anything, they can't hold your attention. They're just a bag of hot air. Amen. But otherwise, if you're just an ignorant person out there, these guys can speak. They can talk. They can preach. They can really hold your attention. Bring tears to your eyes if you don't know better, instead of bringing anger to your voice over their hypocrisy and deception. So I want to spend a little time on Phillips because I just detest and despise this man. He is a little effeminate sissy, is what he was all of his life. And it seems like because he was such a sissy, then he just invited demons into his life. And I'm going to demonstrate all of this for you. So, a lot of what I have to say will come from his own pen. This isn't my opinion. I'm going to take from his own writings, his book, which is this, entitled The Price of Success. There's a picture of Phillips in about, well, that's when he's doing his work, so that's back in the 50s. That's not what he looked like in old age. But, well, he was older then. He was in his 50s, born in 1906. The Price of Success. And I'm going to break this up in different parts. I don't have a lot of time left this morning, but here's what we're going to look at this morning. So this will be part one. The time of his life prior to his translating work. In other words, from the years 1906 to 1940. Let's see how much we can get done here this morning. J.B. Phillips, his own private life from 1906 to 1940. Now, I'm going to start by reading some of the blurps on this book. You know what the term blurb means, B-L-U-R-B? Okay, I use that term a lot. I hope you know what it means. Do you know what it means? Some of you know. It means things that are on the front and backs of books. Publishers put these things on there to get people to pick them up off the book rack and read them. Those are called publishers' blurps, B-L-U-R-B-S. It's a real term. Look it up in the dictionary. It's just... I guess a term for literature and for publishing and writing. So on the back of this, we've got, what the publishers have to say. We've got a quotation from the book, that is by Phillips himself. Then we have a little recommendation by Kenneth Taylor, who's the author of the Living Bible. You have it on the front here, deeply moving, Kenneth Taylor, translator of the Living Bible. They put that on there, so you'll pick it up and read the book. Let me read some of what the publisher has to say. J.B. Phillips began translating the New Testament epistles to to encourage his bomb-threatened London congregation. This is a very moving story, very interesting. I'll give you all the details if you don't have time to buy it and read it. From this humble beginning, a dynamic and prodigious writing career was launched. Radio broadcasting established his reputation as a natural communicator, and requests for him to lecture snowballed. Success was heady, but the price was almost too much to pay. And then he writes himself, I was in a state of excitement throughout the whole of 1955. This was written, by the way, just very recently. Well, it was copyrighted 2 years after his death. That's how recent it was. He wrote it, and it never got to the publisher, and his wife had it published, but it's copyrighted 1984. My work hardly seemed arduous, for it was intrinsically exciting. I was tasting the sweets of success to an almost unimaginable degree. My health was excellent. My future prospects were rosier than my wildest dreams could ever suggest. He made a lot of money from this project here. He just rose from total obscurity to world renown. Just overnight, instantly it happened. Applause, honor, and appreciation met me wherever I went. I was not aware of the dangers of success, the subtle corrosion of character, the unconscious changing of values, and the secret monstrous growth of a vastly inflated idea of myself seeped slowly into me. Vaguely I was aware of this, and like some frightful parody of Augustine, I prayed, Lord, make me humble, but not yet. And then here's what Taylor has to say about him. Taylor writes, I have seldom been as deeply moved as by J.B. Phillips' own description of his euphoria of success followed by his plunge into years of deep depression. Yet in the end, triumph prevailed. Really, it doesn't. So this has been the characteristic of many, it's just surprising, of many of your great well-known Christian leaders and writers, such as C.H. Spurgeon, the Baptist preacher of the late 19th century. You'd be surprised the number of these well-known writers or preachers like Spurgeon, J.B. Phillips, who in their own private life are a nothing but miserable wreck, and who experience years of deep satanic, demonic depression. It has turned a lot of them to 2 Corinthians 12, and they've tried to turn Paul's thorn in the flesh into just that, depression, like they experienced. They said, now there's what God gave Paul because of all the success he had. God gave him a demon of depression, and he went around depressed all of his life. Well, I don't follow that at all. That's a lie. But I guess what I'm saying is it makes me really suspicious of these men and their works, that they can come out in public and be so flowery and so glowing and have miserable lives, marriages that are ruined, bodies that are ruined, but especially minds that are ruined when it comes to depression. So this is what Taylor said. His euphoria of success followed by his plunge into years of deep depression. I mean manic depression. So much so that the only way he finally got his senses back is he had to go to a professor of psychiatry and go through all the long steps of therapy year after year to get himself back on top. Well, I'm not going to trust someone like that. I don't think that Moses' success as the lawgiver caused him to fall into years of deep depression or Paul's or something. I don't trust people like this. I doubt Phillips' conversion. He never even uses terms like that. He just is kind of religious, he would say. And yet everybody thinks of J.B. Phillips, a great Christian writer, British pastor, radio communicator, and so forth. J.B. Phillips, a well-known one, demon-possessed. Well, let me give you some of his background life from 1906 to 1940. According to his own account, he was a queer, eccentric little boy. A little sissy, I think we would say today. And you see children like this. He seems to have been born this way. A very queer, he uses those terms, eccentric little boy. He had a very unloving, overbearing father. And I think he probably kind of adopted some of those Freudian notions. His mother was very kind and sweet to him, so he loved his mother and hated his dad. Very unloving, overbearing father. A thoughtful mother who, however, died of cancer while he was very young. He had an excellent mind and did very well in school, but he was a complete introvert. I hope you can get the picture I want to paint briefly and quickly this morning. He was a complete introvert, a little shy, embarrassed, queer little child. He was afraid of people. He was afraid of bright lights. He had to live in darkness. He was afraid of bright colors. Reds and yellows and blues and greens that were bright scared him. He was afraid of strong sounds. He was afraid of water. He was afraid of air. He was afraid of heights. You get the picture? He tells us, this isn't myself saying this, it's all in the beginning of his book. I mean, he's a weird little sissy of a boy. Seems to be born this way, born with demons, or picked them up early in his life. On numerous occasions, if you don't even read carefully in his book, you'll see that he had very strong psychic tendencies. He's got at least 2 places in his book. For instance, on page 71, where he has, each chapter, like this is a chapter entitled Early Tensions, and each chapter is broken up into little subsections, and he has at least 2 sections that are entitled ESP, and he brags about the fact that he was gifted with ESP. For instance, let me read first of all on page 73, the top of the page. Now, just listen to this paragraph carefully. It's entitled A Hint of the Heavenly. And I've got written out beside it psychic, because if you know anything about psychic people, you can see that's exactly what he is, just as a very young person. He writes, I think that from earliest childhood, I have always been aware of the eternal world. If you read any psychics, they have these same vague, mystical statements. It often seemed to me that I lived in the here and now involuntarily. Almost reincarnation, it seems like he's saying, and perhaps a little impatiently. The innumerable clear and sharp experiences of childhood gave me hints and clues to beauty and reality which plainly transcended earthly life. I could not believe that this little life was my permanent home. The sweetness of music, the loveliness of nature, the beauties of color and form were at times intolerably sweet reminders of some permanent reality lying serenely beyond immediate perception. Doors opened momentarily, that is, to the other world, the spirit world, only to be shut again tantalizingly. One could only be aware of a fleeting glimpse of unutterable beauty. Then earlier on page 71, there is a further memory pin sharp in my mind of a curious episode which happened in 1932 and which nowadays would come under the heading of extrasensory perception. I was sharply awakened in the small hours by a clearly defined picture of my sister, by that time a missionary teacher in India. She was leaning on a veranda. She was weeping in some acute distress. So sharp and vivid was this mental picture that I got out of bed and prayed earnestly for her until I felt she was, to some degree, comforted. I took careful note of the time and date, as well as of the imagined veranda. I had at no time before or since seen a photograph of the place where my sister was teaching or living. In due course the answer came. My sister had indeed been in some considerable distress at the very time I had been awakened and had prayed, and she had, after a while, felt strangely comforted and at peace. And she was, at the time, on the veranda of the teacher's bungalow. Now, you might say, well, I might have experienced something like that. Well, you might have by a gift of the Holy Spirit, by word of knowledge. But as he says, he doesn't call it the word of knowledge. He doesn't know any biblical terminology. He says this is ESP. And throughout his book, he boasts of the psychic tendencies that he has. He never really says it's a gift of God. He just says this is what I have. More or less, this is what I was born with. Let's find another one, page 120. Again, as you see at the very top of the page, entitled ESP. It's got many sections on ESP. He writes, I have known the gift of telepathy. That's an occult gift.
Amen.
I have known the gift of telepathy only a few times in my life, but I had one brilliant example of its powers operating in me that I can never forget. Now, this is the author of J.B. Phillips' Bible. A great friend of mine, Eric, was director of a music store with branches in 2 different cities. We had become, and still are, friends, and at this time I knew that his wife was expecting her 3rd child. It so happened that I was driving my daughter to her little pre-prep school when I passed Eric on his way to his office there. He gave me the thumbs up sign, and I immediately knew that the newborn child was a boy and that his name was Nigel. As soon as I got back to the parsonage, I telephoned Eric and said, "Congratulations on the birth of Nigel." "My God," he replied, and what I can only describe as a voice of awe, "How did you know?" Indeed, how did I know? We had never on any occasion ever speculated about the sex of the baby to be, still less talked about names. Then he concludes, "Sundry less dramatic examples of telepathy have happened between Eric and me over the last 20 years, but neither of us will ever forget that one." Page 119. He's very much in favor of palm reading. Palm reading. Here he tells a story of making the rounds as a pastor in a nearby hospital. And he meets some women that were not a part of his parish, as he said, and they're all laughing and joking in a circle around one particular woman. And he walks up. Whenever they see him, he says they all scuttle back to their beds like naughty little schoolgirls. "Well," I said with mock severity, "and what have you been up to?" The woman, somewhere in her 40s, gave me a rather wry smile. "Well, I was reading their hands," she said. "All right then," I said, "read mine," and gave her my right hand. This woman was not a parishioner of mine. She lived some miles away, had never seen me before in her life. At once, with little or no hesitation, she began to tell me some of the salient points of my past life and to tell me of present hopes and fears. This was, to say the least of it, uncanny, and I said, "Right, now tell me what I was thinking the moment I walked up the stairs to this ward." Without hesitation, she told me that I had been worrying about a new car. This was perfectly true. Our old Banger was on its last legs, and I was only too conscious of the cost of a new one. I pressed her for an explanation. "It's a matter of reading people's thoughts," she said simply. "Of course, I don't read hands, but the fact of holding someone's hand usually makes their thoughts clearer to me." She went on to explain that she had had this gift all her adult life, and it was sometimes embarrassing. Naturally, it was easier with some people than with others. "I would never use this gift for money," she declared emphatically. "All I was doing just now was for a bit of fun because the girls were a bit bored." Further conversation revealed that she was a sincere Christian and she had no explanation to offer for her unusual gift. Well, I've got a good one to offer for that gift. It's from the pit. It's from below. Palm reading, reading people's mind and thoughts. And Phillips, he's a British pastor here, volunteers his own hand to be read. Has he never read the Bible that he translated? Pages 132 and 3, entitled ESP Again. You just find it over and over in this book. It might be interesting here to mention an incident which once more suggested that I had, very occasionally, extrasensory powers. Now, I think where we are in this chapter is he's made his first trip over to America. He was invited to Los Angeles to hold a series of meetings. So he's out west, either in Nevada or in California. The occasion was that Marjorie, my secretary, always a little accident-prone, bless her, had slipped on the pathway as she dashed to run an errand for me and had knocked herself out by striking her head on the concrete. She was unconscious for a while, and it was thought wise to send for an ambulance to take her to the hospital in Redlands, the nearest sizable town. Where's Redlands, somebody? Nevada? One or the other, I'm sure. A radio call was sent and acknowledged, but it seemed a long time before help came. My wife volunteered to accompany Marjorie in the ambulance, and another car followed to bring her back. The time was just after 8 p.m., And my wife recalls a nightmarish journey down the mountain roads, for the ambulance radio was going full blast, receiving calls and repeat calls. I guess it meant repeating, but repeat calls all the way down. Phillips doesn't know anything about what's taking place. He's somewhere else. Shortly before 11 p.m., I began to get anxious. Surely my wife should be back by now. Or had something happened to Marjorie? Had it proved to be worse than they thought? Had she felt she ought to stay in the hospital? I knelt by my bed, and as far as I could, I put my anxieties in the hands of God. As I got up from my knees, I heard the sound of a car approaching. Its tires, spelled T-Y-R-E-S, the British way, shuffling on the soft, sandy road. I looked at my watch and saw that it was 11:04 p.m. I heard my wife's voice say, "Thank you very much for the lift. Good night." Then a man's voice said, "Good night," and I heard the car drive away. I went outside expecting to see her there, but there was no one there at all. I then experienced a strange sense of peace. I flung myself down on the bed and fell immediately asleep. Exactly 1 hour later, at 12:04 a.m., I heard the car again with the same shuffling noise of tires on soft sand. The car stopped. My wife got out. In other words, he had a premonition here, what they call a premonition, and said the same words as I'd heard her speak before. But this time I was actually present, for I dashed from my bed as soon as I heard the noise of the car approaching. My emotions were confused, but I was overwhelmingly glad to see my wife safely back. What had happened? Was this a genuine case of precognition or premonition, or merely my vivid imagination? I cannot answer that except to say that what I have set down happened just like that. I mean, he saw this an hour in advance, heard the tires of the car, heard the car drive up, the sound of the car, heard her get out, what she said, what the man said. He heard that an hour before it happened. And then whenever it happened, it was exactly as he had heard before. So that should, from his own writings, substantiate the fact that he was a psychic, to say the least. To say nothing of any Bible translating abilities, he was a psychic of a fairly high order. It happened all during his life, from when he was a young boy right up to old age. As we saw with his mentioned friend Eric earlier, over a period of 20 years, it happened between him and this man, just that one man. Over a period of 20 years, he had episodes of this take place. Let me say a little more this morning before we want to conclude. What about his religious background? Well, religiously, he had this to say about his early life, and I quote, "I think I must have been born a believer in God, as very early remembered experiences seems to show." Now that's contrary to the Bible he translated, that said that the wicked, that's all who are born, are estranged from the womb. They go astray as soon as they are born, speaking lies. He said he thinks that he must have been born a believer in God. But remember I said that his father was overbearing and his mother died of cancer? Well, his mother's suffering and death just shattered his faith, as he writes on page 37. "Most of the time in those last months she hardly knew us, and I grew angrier and angrier with God that he could allow such terrifying physical and mental degradation to happen to such a wonderful woman. I gave up my religious faith utterly. For what use was prayer and talk of the love of God when I returned daily to this horrible caricature of the sprightly, witty mother I had known and loved? I became, as I thought, a confirmed atheist. The problem of human suffering is, I believe, the biggest serious obstacle to faith in a God of love today." You see, he's a typical religious person. Just because his mother was a, quote, good mother, he thinks that God owed her something. She was probably an unregenerate just like he was. He doesn't have any comprehension of what it means to be born again. He just knows that, if you're in the Anglican Church and you're baptized and christened as a baby, you grow up as a believer in God. That's his attitude toward all of this. His father remarried a few years later, And he had a terrible experience with the hatred he had for his stepmother. And I think the feeling was returned. Pages 44 and 45. I don't propose to deal in any depth with the emotional effect of my mother's tragic death. I felt I'd lost my greatest friend and, in a sense, my home. I had now no great incentive to work. He was in school by this time, and I think I must in fairness give credit to the school itself for carrying me on without despair and overmuch bitterness. Domestically, we were cared for by another domestic treasure by the name of Rhoda, and all three of us owe her a great debt. We saw almost nothing of our grief-stricken father. He had 2 siblings, and we certainly had no idea that before many months had passed, he was considering marriage to his 6-foot, 2-inch wartime secretary. I sometimes think, she must be a German, I sometimes think that my stepmother did far more emotional harm than she could have possibly realized. We 3 were perfectly normal, reasonably happy children. I don't know about normal, but maybe happy. And though still suffering from the loss of our mother, were quite prepared to cooperate with a mother substitute. Our stepmother had been a fairly frequent visitor to the house and had always treated us with courtesy and a rather reserved kindness. But the moment she became my father's wife, remember she was his secretary earlier, she changed instantly into a terrifying killjoy. There was nothing with which she did not find fault. If one said nothing at the table, one was accused of being sullen. If we did pluck up courage to speak, we were nearly always shot down in flames, though perhaps that is an inappropriate phrase to use to describe her replies. She was the conversation stopper of all time. I cannot remember any guest coming to the house, and I must say I am not surprised. My brother was sent to Lawrence College while I continued at another place with the promise that I would go to Cambridge later. My sister was in such and such place. I can remember once saying casually when he came home from school, "Well, I think I'll go up to my room now." Back came the freezing reply, "It's not your room, John." She insisted on calling me this, though everyone else called me Jack. "It is the room I allow you to use." Can you believe your own mother, stepmother, would say that to you? This was wounding enough, but we found out that little by little all our childhood treasures disappeared, including anything that could possibly remind us of our mother. Evidently a very horrible stepmother. When we arrived home for the holidays, the first question was, "Well, how long is it this time?" And a chill of unwelcome lay over everything. Had a very difficult situation there. Once in college at Cambridge, he came under the influence of evangelical Christianity and was evidently, unconsciously, quote-unquote, converted. If you can be such. That's what he says here. He never uses the term born again, never uses that term, never said that he got converted. It's just some type of unconscious awakening or something that he had. So this is what I call the period of J.B. Phillips' unconscious born-again experience. If you're born again, you know that you're born again. You change. Something happens to you. Well, not him. Unconsciously he went through something, which means you didn't go through anything. Here, the end of this chapter on adolescent struggles. I went up to Cambridge as an avowed atheist, and I don't think I ever attended college chapel. But, as is almost inevitable, I was before long approached by members of both the student Christian movement and of that formidable evangelical group called the Cambridge Intercollegiate Christian Union. Things like comparable to Navigators or InterVarsity or something over here in the United States. I can remember attending meetings of both societies and felt strangely attracted by some members of CICCU. I had never met men before to whom Christ was a living reality, as real as any human friend. Their certainty about God, their utter personal devotion to Christ, and their willingness to go to any lengths to win someone else to Christ could hardly fail to impress a very young for his age 18-year-old. But I resisted membership of the Christian Union for some months. I could not understand their ban on smoking, on cinema or theater going, or indeed on any worldly pleasure. In sober fact, I was abstaining from even the most innocent of worldly pleasures for the simple reason that I could not afford any of them. But the puritanical insistence on abstention from anything that the, quote, world, unquote, offered in the way of pleasure or amusement was something I found very hard to take and still do. In other words, he'd be opposed to anyone saying you can't do anything. No drinking, no cigarette smoking, no this, and none of that. He said, I found it very difficult to take then, and I still do. One other reference, page 55. For these Sunday gatherings, prominent evangelical preachers were invited from far and wide, and although I was often puzzled and sometimes disagreed, I had never heard such fervent and persuasive preaching in my life. Although I had been brought up to treat the Scriptures with reverence, I had never before met men to whom the Bible was the Word of God, the actual means through which the living God spoke to men. I could not fail to be impressed, and before long, although without any, and he puts it in quotation marks, conversion experience. It's kind of, he poo-poos that idea. You don't go through a conversion. That's for, religious tent meetings and so forth. Although without any religious or without any conversion experience, quote unquote, I joined the Christian Union with certain reservations which persisted throughout my Cambridge days. So in his writings, he never tells during this period of a biblical born-again experience. He seems to be totally unaware of that terminology. He uses the term conversion, quote unquote, and when you're doing that, you're mocking the term. Evidently, it was Phillips' belief that you could just kind of wake up saved. Just kind of wake up saved. And let's not forget what he said, I think I must have been born a believer in God. So that helps if you're born saved, and then you reject God because of the suffering he put your mother through, and you come back to him later in life. He was ordained after college to the ministry as a parish priest in the Church of England. But he experienced a series of mental and nervous breakdowns, the most serious of which were related to the success of his later writing, and he only finally gets back on top, somewhat, I wouldn't call it really on top, just not on the bottom, through the help of a friend who was a professor of psychiatry. Okay, that takes us in J.B. Phillips' life from 1906 up to, generally speaking, up to 1940. So we're going to stop with that. Next time we're going to go into some of the later periods of his life, especially those periods of his life during which he was busy translating his New Testament. You're getting a feel for the man J.B. Phillips now. Yes. See, Moffat, I don't know personally a lot about Moffat's own personal life. We see enough of his problems theologically in his translation. And we'll see some theological problems, some very definite, obvious, blatant ones with Phillips as well. But what I just find horrifying is this man's personal life, demon-possessed. And it's like he's not even afraid to say that. He boasts of telepathy, premonitions, ESP. He didn't have to write this book and tell all about that. If he thought that this book would stop the sales of this book, I'm sure he never would have done it. But he just assumes, well, there's nothing wrong. The Bible doesn't say anything about ESP or psychic experiences. There's nothing wrong with that. And he imputes his lack of knowledge to the rest of the Christian world. And he's probably right. They don't care about that. They think that sounds good, a mystic and a Bible translator. They wouldn't say, like I said, demon-possessed, but I think that he was.
Hear my cry, O God, attend unto my prayer. From the ends of the earth will I cry unto thee. And when my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. That is higher than I. Hallelujah.